And with that, let's dive in. So first and foremost, thank you all so much for joining me today while we'll be speaking about how to better support your past due customers in post-COVID. Now, my name is Allison Doyle. I am a senior behavioral scientist at Symend. My background is a PhD in cognitive psychology from the University of Calgary. And my background and training is really focused on how context and language can influence our decision-making and our behaviors. In my more recent years, so for the last 4 or 5 years, I've been working in applied behavioral science within the financial space. So really working on how we can help consumers adopt those positive financial behaviors that they want to make for themselves. I also wanted to take a moment briefly to just introduce Symend. So Symend, where I work, is a behavioral engagement platform. And more importantly, what we do is we partner with our service providers to be able to provide the optimal experience for your consumers through digital engagement. So we're really building those interactions that are meaningful for your consumers based on their needs. And of course, that rapidly changing environment that we've all come to know because needs are very complex for our consumers. So we do this by using behavioral science and data science. And of course, as part of that, we're really building those data-driven insights to constantly adapt and optimize on those engagements for your consumers. Now, as you can imagine, part of doing this for so long has really given us an in-depth understanding of consumers, their expectations, and their needs. And so that's part of what I'm hoping to share with you today. Now, I've shared a little bit about myself, about Symend, but I'm certainly hoping to understand a little bit about you, the audience. So before we dive into the core of the presentation, I'm hoping you'll take a moment and just quickly throw in the join the conversation chat. What is your current level of familiarity with behavioral science? So just asking you to kind of rank between 0 and 3. Now, 0 would be no knowledge. I don't really know behavioral science. This is very new to me. And all the way up to 3 would be maybe you've taken courses in behavioral science, you've worked with a behavioral scientist. So just looking for you to provide what is that honest level. Perfect. So I'm seeing some responses coming in. Looks like we have a few ones. We have a 3, so there is some variety. I'm just going to give it a few more seconds. Really, no judgment. Just be honest with yourself. If you don't want to throw it in the chat, you can also just think to yourself, what is my current level of understanding? So far, it looks like most of our participants today are rating themselves as a 1, so there's some existing knowledge. That's great. It is my pleasure today to continue to introduce you to behavioral science and certainly how behavioral science can be used to support our consumers. And in terms of what we're going to be covering today, it is a brief session, but I'm hoping to kind of get through 3 core pieces. So 1, of course, the impacts of COVID-19 on our consumers' expectations and particularly digitization. What behavioral science is and why it's important for our customer engagement. And then lastly, just to touch on and give you a little bit to walk away with today in terms of how behavioral science can be leveraged to support our consumers. So with that, let's dive in. So COVID-19 really ended up bringing up situations and contexts for all of us that we'd never experienced before. It was something that no one could predict, and the types of things that it put us through, whether long-term behaviors or short-term circumstance, was something that was new for everyone. Now, Symend, in an effort to really empower and support consumers, wanted to understand what were the long-term effects of COVID-19, and specifically, how could service providers support consumers through these long-term effects, and what are those impacts for those consumers? Now, what we did to be able to understand this is focus on our consumers' perceptions, their attitudes, and their behaviors. And to get this information, we turned to our in-house team of research experts. So they actually conducted last summer a study with 2,000 consumers from the US and Canada. And we put together a consolidated COVID-19 report. So this report actually consisted of the findings from this study, findings from a series of studies we had been running on regular intervals throughout COVID-19. We brought in a lot of secondary research from other experts who've been working in this field and trying to understand the impacts of COVID. And then, of course, our in-house subject matter experts and our learnings from treating tens of millions of customers over the last 2 years of COVID. Now, I won't be able to go into detail with all of the report's findings and insights today, but I would highly recommend, if you're interested, please do go to our virtual booth. It's available through the main page in the exhibit hall, and you can actually get a copy of that report. There's also a associated webinar recording that you can listen to, so lots of information there that's available. But for today, I'm really just going to be scratching the surface on some of our key findings. So a few of our key findings is really, it shouldn't be surprising that individuals really are using digital tools more now than they ever were before the pandemic. So there's a lot of people who are either using these digital tools more than they were, or there's actually a whole set of consumers who are adopting the use of digital tools for the very first time. What we're seeing is that it's not just the case that they were adopting these tools because they were convenient during the pandemic, but there's also a significant amount of these people who plan to continue to use these digital tools in this post-pandemic world. So this is now becoming a long-term shift in behavior. And what it's leading to is really that quick acceleration of digital transformation. So our consumers are expecting us to provide digital tools, services, and options for them. And we as service providers and partners really need to work quickly to meet these expectations, because as you can see, a lot of consumers are willing to consider leaving their service provider if they don't feel like those digital tool expectations are being met. But the answer to this really isn't as simple as just providing more digital tools and options and kind of more digital engagement for your consumer, because they're also experiencing something called digital fatigue. Now, digital fatigue is the outcome of spending large quantities of time online on digital devices. And while it has a myriad of negative mental and physical effects, it also makes our consumers very selective about what they're paying attention to and what they're doing with their online time. One thing I want to say is that when it comes to digital fatigue, we actually saw the presence of digital fatigue in different income groups and different employment types. So it's not really the case that it's traditional office workers who ended up going remote during the pandemic, and those were the ones experiencing it. This was also present in people who may be working in the service industry and who stayed in person for a great majority of their time during the pandemic, but who also were just spending lots of time online, let's say connecting with friends and family, everything else that could be happening during the pandemic. So this is really present not just in one particular group of individuals, but across pretty much everyone within North America. Now, the outcome of this is that those who are experiencing digital fatigue are a lot more likely to ignore emails and texts. They're being selective about how they're providing their attention. And so you can imagine, as a service provider, when you're trying to engage with this person, they're a lot less likely to be paying attention to your outreaches and your interactions unless they're really resonating with them in the moment. They're being more selective and more picky about, is this actually something that's going to benefit me? The other side of this is that our consumers are more likely to actually miss or be late paying their bills. Now, part of this is due to their attention, where they might just not be aware that those bills were due because they are being selective. But the other part, of course, is that there is financial burden associated with the pandemic for some people. So this is really creating a difficult situation for us as providers, where just adding more digital tools and services with a blanket approach isn't necessarily going to be the right way to support our consumers. So we've called this the digital paradox. We have our consumers asking us and seeking out these digital offerings more now than ever, but at the same time, they're experiencing this digital fatigue. So they're kind of habituated to our attempts to reach out and support them, meaning they're not really paying as much attention to it. There's a lot of noise in the system as many service providers are trying to reach out and support them at the same time. And this means that we need to adapt our engagement strategies. We need to work together. We need to be able to get a clear understanding of what our consumers are really looking for and be able to build those engagements that are going to meet them where they're at. So we're working with our consumer. Tell us what you're feeling, what you need from us, and then we're going to build that kind of personalization for you to make sure that you feel supported in the moment. Now, this is where behavioral science really starts to come in. So here I'm going to take a pause and kind of introduce what behavioral science really is. Now, put simply, behavioral science is the study of decision making. And specifically, we examine context, attention, and all the other external factors that can influence why someone may be making a certain decision or taking a certain action. My job as a behavioral scientist is to then really help create environments and situations that help people bridge the gap between their intentions and their actions. So when we think about this action intention gap, we can use a pretty simple example. Let's say that I have a goal to get outside and exercise more during the day. That's my intention. I really want to do that for myself. I understand the benefits, but am I actually acting in ways, am I actually doing that behavioral thing that I have that intention for? So maybe I'm not getting outside. Maybe I'm only getting outside 2 days a week. Why is it that I have a strong intention, but my actions don't reflect that? And so my job is to understand what are the barriers, what are the challenges or the facilitators to making sure that we can bridge that gap. And that's what we do as behavioral scientists. So one of the ways that we can work to bridge those gaps between action and intention is using our tools called behavioral concepts. Now, behavioral concepts are ultimately different approaches, different ways that we can interact with a person or create an environment that's going to help them alleviate the challenges and the barriers to committing those actions or leverage the facilitators to committing those actions. And there are hundreds of well-known behavioral concepts within the behavioral science field. They've been used, they've been established, there's research to back these up. But to kind of help you understand, I'm going to take a deep dive through one example. So one example of a behavioral concept is something called mental accounting. Now, what this is that people tend to put their money into mental pots. So let's say I make a certain amount of money every month, and I know that X amount is going to go to savings, X amount is what I can spend on fun entertainment. This is what I can spend on groceries, on utilities, so on and so forth. I've kind of put all of these into different pots. Now, as you put your money into these mental pots, it actually makes you very resistant to want to take money from one to move to the other, even if it's advantageous to you. So an example could be that someone is falling behind on a bill, and even though they have money in their savings that they could use to pay that bill and eliminate late fees or additional interest charges, so it's more advantageous to them, they're kind of reluctant and unwilling to do so. So that's an example of kind of that fallacy where they're not really mentally accounting properly. As a behavioral scientist, we can engage with them and provide more information about the importance and actually the benefit of them taking that money out of one pot and using it for another. So you're actually going to save money in the long run. You're not going to be paying interest rates and additional fees. By doing that, we help that person realize that money is very fungible. It moves freely from one pot to another. And so that person is more likely to actually take that action that's more beneficial for them financially. So that's a financial example, but I also wanted to provide an example in kind of the wild, something that we're all very familiar with. So here, now as expert behavioral scientists, everyone in the audience, you now know what behavioral science is, how it operates, at least to some degree. We're going to put on that behavioral scientist lens, and we're going to look to see how we might sell the most bundles of milk and Oreos in a grocery store. So to do this, we've been set with the parameter that we can offer a $1 discount when they buy milk and Oreos together, but it's up to us for how we frame this approach. So that's the context that we're creating for those consumers. We can offer $1 off when you buy the milk and Oreos together. We could also offer $1 off the milk when you buy the Oreos and milk together. or offer $1 off the Oreos when you buy the milk and Oreos together. So always a dollar discount, but how we frame it and on what item it's presented on differs. So your job as behavioral scientists is to use the join the conversation again and let me know which of these three do you think would result in the most bundled sales? So which one is going to drive sales the most? Is it A, $1 off both, B, $1 off the milk, or C, $1 off the Oreos? Yes, and I'm sorry I didn't provide Jeopardy music. Patrick is correct. That would have been great. All right, so I have seen quite a few people say C. I'm going to give it a few more seconds. Does anyone else have a guess? A, B, or C? Okay, I have a vote for A. Awesome. All right, so I am going to reveal it is in fact C. Now, traditional traditional behavioral economics would tell us that all three of these are going to result in the same amount of sales because it's the same discount. However, that's not actually the case. So C really results in the most sales. And reason being, now that we've thought about mental accounting and behavioral science, is that as we put our money into pots, Oreos typically doesn't fall into the grocery pot of money. So it's considered kind of a treat item. Now, that leads to us having a bit of guilt for being able to buy this treat item. It doesn't fall into our traditional spending pot. And so by providing the dollar off of the Oreo specifically, it can kind of remove some of that feeling of guilt because you're getting a discount on it already. And so more people will be willing to make this purchase. All right, so now that we've looked at actual behavioral science, we are now going to move into, well, how are some of the ways that you can use your knowledge of behavioral science to be able to further support your consumers? So I think everyone to some degree is currently using some level of personalization to engage with their consumers and support them. And I don't think that this particular presentation is shocking that we need not a one size fits all approach, but rather to be rather specific in helping our consumers in their specific context and their problems and their needs. So to build those lasting relationships, I wanted to kind of end today on following. There's different layers and steps of incorporating both behavioral science and personalization into how you support your consumers. So with these next few slides, I really encourage you to think about your current organization, your current approach with your consumers, and kind of assess where you currently are and maybe where you'd like to be as you work towards more of that digital transformation and meeting these new post-COVID expectations. So there's really three layers. The first, of course, is just to listen, review, test, and repeat. So most providers are conducting some kind of consumer survey on a regular basis. You're also looking at your consumers' behaviors. What actions are they completing? What are you asking them to complete? And as you understand that, you can start to take the lens of behavioral science and look at, well, what are the barriers to them completing the actions that we'd like them to or that they'd like to for themselves? And what are the facilitators? Now, once you know those, you can start to design that campaign, that engagement strategy that's really going to help deal with some of those barriers and leverage those facilitators. And then really, we should always be testing. So we know that our consumers' environments change, their needs change. And so what's working right now might not be what always works. And so we should continue to test and learn and retest over time. Now, if you're on level one right now, there's really the next stage of this to incorporate more of that personalization. And what you can do here is develop those personas based on step one. So there's going to be certain barriers and facilitators for certain groups of people. You can parse those out and really start to design those specific campaigns. And again, you should still be testing, learning, and retesting. And then, of course, the last step, which we know can be very difficult and take a lot of time and investment, but is ultimately very worth it to support your consumers, is to start to actually build a full set of outcomes of every possible behavior. And as you do this, you really need a dynamic system or platform that's going to be able to see what the person does with the first interaction and then select the next best action based on what they've done. So then it's dynamic in the moment. You're actually meeting that consumer where they're at in that space and time, and you're updating on the fly. And the last step of that is to really have that platform learn from each of those interactions. And so over time, you're optimizing all those interactions that you have, and the system is learning from itself. So I will say, I understand this is a really difficult thing to get to, kind of that third level of hyper-personalization in the moment. But I wanted to share just briefly that, we've seen great ROI when we do this, and we've also seen that we provide really strong relationships with consumers as a result. So it can be a lot to invest in this, but you will see the rewards, and you'll also really build that, lasting relationship with loyal consumers as a result. So I'm hoping what you took away from today, although very brief, is the understanding that consumers have this expectation of digital communications, but a one-size-fits-all approach isn't going to work because of this digital fatigue that creates a digital paradox. I also hope that you've seen that behavioral science can help bridge that gap between our consumers, their intentions, and their actions. And that as we learn about our customers, we can test using those different behavioral concepts, and we can really start to hyper-personalize our customer communications. So with that, I think I've left us a few moments for questions. I do see one in the chat, so I'm just gonna read that out, and then I will see if there's any others. So to combat digital fatigue, can we resort to more traditional methods of communication, such as phone calls or mail? I think this is a great question. And ultimately, I think it's important to note that it's not our expectation that everything should move to digital. Certainly what I feel like, and I think what Symend's kind of vision is that by having that optimized digital engagement for a consumer, you give them the option to be able to self-serve. Especially when we look at our past due customers, we know that there's some guilt or shame about finding themselves in those situations, regardless of how they got there. And so they can be reluctant to use those traditional methods, especially phone or in person, because they perceive that maybe they're being judged, although I think we'd all agree they're not. So the ideal situation, in my opinion, is to have that self-service solution and allow a lot of customers to use that who are interested in it. But what that does is kind of free up your agents and your other resources for that high touch to be available for those who want it, or for maybe who have more complex needs and really need that high touch solution. All right, and the second question I'm seeing, you mentioned there are hundreds of behavioral concepts. Based on the concepts that you've tested, which ones seem most effective? So another really good question, and yes, there are hundreds of behavioral concepts. If you go online, you'll definitely see quite a few listed. In terms of my experience and what I have found to be really successful, the first one for me is empathy. So that's really our North Star at Symend. We are all about empowering customers, making sure that they feel supported. And especially during the pandemic and even in this post-pandemic world, by showing your customers that you genuinely care, you want to help and support them, that's really something that starts to bring them to the table and breeds that strong relationship. Another one that has been highly successful for us, and I think is something that we can all kind of resonate with when it comes to our delinquent customers or our past due customers, is self-agency. So many individuals who find themselves behind on bills or struggling to pay those bills on time can often feel like they don't have control over their situation anymore, and that taking action really isn't going to have the desired effect, the outcome that they want. So by actually supporting people and making them feel like they're in the driver's seat, they have control, you're going to provide the options, but what they choose to do is really up to them. You can make them feel autonomous and more willing to step in, lean in, and take control over this situation, although it may seem overwhelming. All right, do we have any other questions? Perfect. So with that, what I will say in our last few minutes here is we definitely appreciate Payments Canada for allowing us to give this presentation today. Thank you so much. It's really been a pleasure. Thank you to all of you for joining this session. I hope you have a wonderful day. Enjoy the other sessions that are out here. And definitely we'd love to see you at our virtual booth. We do have several Symenders who are going to be manning it today. They are definitely eager to hear from you, to answer your questions, get to know you if you're interested. And of course, in that virtual booth, we do have both our post-COVID report as well as the associated webinar available for you. So hope to see you there. Thanks all.